Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, Mikki here. Welcome to Mikkipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Brendon Egan about exogenous ketones and exercise through the lifespan. Two unrelated but equally interesting topics. Firstly, on exogenous ketones, we talk about how they may be used in different exercise contexts, where the science is at and lacking, and the potential application in the longer distance events. And Brendon gives a really good rundown of our current knowledge base and where there are gaps. And also we have a good discussion around the sort of practical application as a clinician, because Brendon is a sports nutritionist also, versus what you read in the literature, which I always find super helpful and interesting as a practitioner myself. We then shift gears to discussing exercise in general and why the strength, muscle function, and muscle health are important concepts as we age. We discuss the potential for a catabolic crisis and how this can take decades worth of muscle off somebody's frame in a heartbeat. We talk about sarcopenia and how we might best define it through the lens of increasing opportunities to avoid it rather than from a diagnosis or deficit model. And we also talk about what counts in terms of strength work as we age, i.e., what about gardening? How about Pilates? I think you're going to get a lot from this conversation. It was super informative from my perspective, and I know that you guys love a bit of a geek out, but in a way that allows you to understand it. For those of you unfamiliar with Brendon, he is an Associate Professor of Sport and Exercise Physiology at the School of Health and Human Performance at Dublin City University in Ireland. Brendon received his BSc in Sport and Exercise Science from the University of Limerick, an MSc in Sport and Exercise Nutrition from Loughborough, and a PhD from Dublin City University. He also completed postdoctoral training at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. His interests are both in sports performance and exercise and aging. Now, Brendon doesn't really exist on the internet. You will find him if you go to ResearchGate, but I have included a link to his profile at DCU. Before we crack on into the podcast, just a reminder that the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favourite podcast listening platform. This increases the visibility of the podcast out there in amongst literally thousands of other podcasts, so more people get the opportunity to learn from guests that I have on the show, like Brendon. All right, team, please enjoy this conversation that I have with Dr. Brendon Egan. Dr. Brendon Egan, thanks so much for taking the time this morning, to chat to me about your work. Now, it was interesting because I've heard you for a number of years on numerous podcasts discussing different topics and particularly, of course, research in and around muscle health and function. And then, of course, more recently, some of your ketone work in the athletic performance space. But of course, you've been working in that for many years. So can we start with a bit of your background and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you sort of have progressed across your years?
Yeah, sure thing. I was trained as a sport and exercise scientist as an undergrad, and during that time I became more interested in metabolism and physiology, and I was faced with the choice of how to get a job out of doing a sports science degree. So I decided to specialize with a master's in sports nutrition. But even by doing that, and I've practiced as a sports nutritionist as a result for the best part of 20 years. But during that masters, I really became interested in the research process, and it actually took me down a route where I initially thought I'd be looking at things around exercise intensity and fueling. And the supervisor I had back in Dublin City University at that time was more interested in the molecular side of things. And you kind of you're dictated by what your supervisor is interested in when you're doing your PhD. So I ended up working much more in the area of molecular exercise science for the best part of my PhD, 4 years, postdoc for a couple of years. And that took me down a route where I began to ask the question of fine knowing all this molecular work, but where are the practical applications of research and how do they translate into the real world? So when I moved back to my first job, my first lecturing job, so to speak, my first independent role as a principal investigator, I was working closely with someone who was interested in aging and sarcopenia, who was Professor Giuseppe De Vito, based in University College Dublin. So it was really from that point that we began to work together. He had a slant, obviously, on the exercise side. I had a bit of a slant on the nutrition side. We were working together on a number of different projects there. And, through so that was kind of the aging and muscle health domain. And that, it's what I've been working on probably, now for the best part of 10 years or more. And it was probably later that, I was always, as I said, practicing as a sports nutritionist, with teams, especially team sport players, because that was my own sporting background. But we were always obviously doing little bits and pieces here around performance nutrition research as well. And at some point, ketones came on the map, and we were one of the first groups who was really looking at the question about, basically the metabolism of ketone bodies during exercise, the rationale for why they might work as a supplement. And when you begin to delve into that area, you begin to see that ketones are really pleiotropic in terms of the effects they can have on the body, whether it's a performance or from a health point of view. And so that's kind of then been a major theme in my group for the best part of 5-6 years now.
Yeah, I find it so interesting. You mentioned that about ketones, just in that, because you do come across certain supplements, for example, where they tend to work on a number of different levels, and people are like, how can that possibly do all of these different things which are seemingly unrelated? But it is because they're working on the sort of similar or same pathways, I suppose.
Of course, yeah. We've done lots of work on lots of different supplements, beetroot juice, caffeine, caffeinated chewing gum, protein hydrolysates, a variety of different things that we've worked on. And the interesting thing about any supplement is that it's on the shelf, and it's people are using it, and some are reporting benefits and some are not. And when you drill down then into the mechanistic basis, that's always a good place to be in terms of trying to understand, like, why would this work in theory, and what are the physiological mechanisms that might be at play here. And again, like I mentioned, a lot of those supplements, you can look at the different aspects of physiology, but it becomes amazing when you look at ketones at just about how many different effects that they can have. Now, as we'll probably talk about later, that doesn't necessarily translate into a performance benefit, but in terms of what ketone bodies can do, it is really amazing how many roles they have. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised, and again, maybe we'll talk about this later, because the role of ketones in the body in terms of why they're evolutionarily conserved and why their generation is amplified during periods of starvation or low carbohydrate availability. There's a reason why they're there, and it's just, I guess, more recently, it's the fact that they're available as a supplement that has really spurred on the research in the last number of years.
Yeah, well, why don't we just actually start there? Because I think that's a really good place maybe for you to describe potentially some of the benefits of, or the roles of ketones. And then I know that you've written a paper that looks in and around the ketogenic diet and how that might differ to actually taking exogenous ketones. So that would be quite good if you're...
Yeah, okay. So we'll go back to basics and just start with, what are the ketone bodies themselves. So usually when we're talking about ketone bodies, it's acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. And these are molecules that are produced, they're lipid-derived or fat-derived molecules, and produced within the liver. And we're always producing a small amount of ketones, ketogenesis as the process is called. But the rate of ketogenesis is amplified under different conditions. The most obvious condition is in the period of starvation, so the absence of nutrient input. And the reason I bring that up is that the thinking is really, and this goes back to the 60s when it was first demonstrated, is that when there is an absence or a reduction in glucose availability, there's you might say an energy crisis within the brain, in that the brain is heavily reliant on glucose as a fuel, and fats don't cross the blood-brain barrier as a metabolic substrate. So the body has developed, and as I said, is evolutionarily conserved across many species, developed a pathway in which fatty acids are converted to ketones within the liver, and they're then able to be transported to the brain to be used as an alternative fuel. Now, it's not just the brain. The ketone bodies are used in multiple different tissues, and that's part of the reason why there's quite a bit of interest in their use in heart failure, as a substrate for the failing heart, but also then in the area of muscle in terms of performance. So, going back to that point about the studies in the 60s, were essentially showing that when people were starved for prolonged periods of time, the contribution of ketone bodies to brain metabolism became, more than half of the substrate. So there's still an amount of glucose around because we have processes such as gluconeogenesis, but ketogenesis is then, as I said, being amplified during this, and it's now providing a substrate for the brain as well. So that kind of leads us to other situations where ketogenesis is amplified. And that's, again, one obvious example is the ketogenic diet. So a scenario where we have a restraint on carbohydrate intake leads to equivalent, well, let's say not totally equivalent, but similar metabolic conditions as starvation, in that there's a lower than usual supply of glucose or of glucose availability within the body, and that therefore will amplify the rates of ketogenesis. So the provision of obviously of a very high fat diet, which is what the ketogenic diet is, and low carbohydrate in that case, will cause this amplification of ketogenesis. And then ketone bodies is obviously what's been measured in the blood when people are saying they're in ketosis. So, they're the kind of basic concepts, I think, around ketogenesis, ketone bodies, the state of ketosis. And as I said, that all the examples I gave, starvation, ketogenic diet, they are dietary changes that occur over days, weeks, months. And where ketone supplements or exogenous ketone supplements come in is that, again, this is going back to the 70s. There was quite a bit of interest in the idea of ketone supplements. But it's only in the last, say, 10 to 15 years where there's really been an emergence of many different types of exogenous ketone supplements. So we refer to them as ketone salts, ketone esters is another. Medium chain triglycerides can also be ketogenic. There's a compound called butanediol, which is similar to an alcohol, which is also ketogenic. So there's a number of these different compounds now that when they're ingested acutely, so in a small bolus of anything from, say, 10 to 50 grams, that these can really produce a rapid, transient, over a number of hours, but a rapid increase in ketone body concentrations. And that, again, is what we call, it is a state of ketosis. In this case, it's called acute nutritional ketosis by most people. So that's a starting point in terms of the concepts around the diet, diet-induced ketosis, or this acute nutritional ketosis from different supplements.
Yeah, interesting, because I've chatted to a few people now about ketones, Dom D'Agostino,
Yeah.
and on the sort of brain perspective or brain health space, Stephen Cunane has we've chatted about exogenous ketones and stuff like that. So with regards to, I guess, your work, Brendon, what is it primarily that you're sort of interested in on that performance space?
Yeah, so we got into this space initially looking at performance, and I can mention some of the ideas around health, I suppose, as well, that we've later become interested in. But in the initial instance, it was around about 2015 or 16, and there was a lot of talk at that time about, this is now not in the scientific literature because there had been no papers at this point, but there was a lot of chatter in the performance nutrition space, particularly around whether British Cycling had been using this, this new novel compound, and whether Tour de France cyclists were using this miracle supplement and so on. And again, through knowing people within the applied practice, these stories and interest was coming back to us. And as it's subsequently been shown in terms of just patent filing and so on, like this exogenous ketone supplement in the form of a ketone monoester that has been around since around 2012 or 13. So it was only in 2016 where the first published paper came out, and at that time we had been working over the course of, say, 2015-16 on a review looking at ketone body metabolism. As I said, at the time, the supplement that was on the market at that time was a ketone salt. And we had done an initial preliminary piece of work on just the metabolic response to ingesting this ketone salt and whether it affected substrate utilization during exercise. Very simple, basic study, but well done in well-trained individuals. And then in summer 2016, this paper comes out by the group at Oxford that seemingly shows a 2% performance improvement in a 30-minute time trial in elite cyclists. And that kind of exploded interest in the field then in like I said, in 2016. cycling. So at that point, it became, it was essentially, there was at least one news story every month that was, in one of either the cycling magazines, or it could be even in things like The Guardian, their Tour de France preview would maybe mention, are these ketone supplements being used? So it seemed at that time to be a very hot area, and there were, as I said, few studies coming out. So I think over the course of 2017, 18, 19, 20, a lot more people independent research groups began to get into this space. And we did a couple of studies around using, acute ingestion of this ketone monoester for running performance. So we looked at intermittent running performance. We looked at 10K time trial. There was a group in Belgium who was also Peter Hespel's group, who've been doing a lot of work, again, with elite cyclists under lots of different designs, very nicely done work. So over the course of 3 or 4 years after that initial study, there was a lot of nice work done. And the interesting thing is, effectively, it showed, all of these other studies showed that there was no performance benefit. And that's kind of been, it's been a bit of a conundrum, because the first study that came out was nicely performed, it was in a good journal, nice looking data, and subsequent studies, in our review, I can't remember off the top of my head how many were ketone ester studies, but it's got to be close to 10 or 12 at this stage, that effectively showed no performance benefit. And again, with research, as you well know, there's lots of differences between study design considerations, the co-ingestion of different fuels, the type of performance test that's being used, the type of athletes that are being used. So, you can see little differences between studies where, that might explain when there is or isn't a performance difference. But as we wrote in that recent review that you mentioned, the overall weight of the evidence at the moment would say that there's, there is a second study that's kind of showing the performance benefit that came out late last year. But essentially on the athletic performance, the idea that you acutely ingest these exogenous ketone supplements, you measure performance outcome, the vast majority show no performance benefit. Yet, again, according to all anecdote and again newspaper stories and so on, there still seems to be fairly heavy use of these exogenous ketone supplements in the peloton, in particular in professional cycling. So it's hard to reconcile the data that's in the scientific literature with the data that's in the anecdotes coming from professional sport.
Yeah, interesting. And in your experience, Brendon, do you work with people who, despite the fact that of some of your findings, do you still practice nutrition with clients and see anyone that you consult with or in your circle who might use them and say that they benefit?
Well, that's a great question, and it's probably a broader question than just for ketone supplements themselves. And it's something that I've always grappled with as someone who works in applied practice, but also who works in academia. So I would say at the moment, so to answer you directly, I don't know anyone at the moment who's using exogenous ketone supplements and reporting the performance benefit. But I know other practitioners who are working in elite sport who are using exogenous ketone supplements, and the athletes do like them. So there's something there. And again, we may get into this, but there are other mechanisms by which these exogenous ketone supplements might be having effects, whether it's on recovery. There was a recent paper also showing that there's a transient rise in EPO after an ingestion of exogenous ketone supplements in recovery. So, there are other things going on that could be potentially having an effect. But to go back to your question about, the difference between, say, practice and research, I think it's a really interesting question, because as a practitioner, if you had an individual and you were to try a strategy, it could be a change in diet, or it could be a change in say, dietary supplements around performance, and that person reports a benefit, or they report feeling better, or they suggest, that was my best performance. As a practitioner, you're kind of faced with the challenge, the evidence base might not be there. We tried it out because we'd heard it might be a benefit, or some other athlete was using it. But now the athlete I'm working with thinks that this is really enhancing the performance.
Yeah.
So that's the anecdotal side. And then, maybe you might say the placebo effect or so on. And so in some ways you kind of say, well, that's fair enough. Now, ketone supplements you could maybe argue against because they're so expensive. You might want to be sure that they're having an effect before you're spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
But the other, I think, way of approaching it as an objective way, this is particularly, I think true with sports that, like endurance sports in particular, where you have very objective measures of performance, and those athletes are really dialed in terms of the training that they're doing, the types of workouts they're doing, maybe the courses that they run or the track sessions that they do, and they know whether they're having a performance benefit or not. It's a little bit more difficult in team sport because there's so many variables that affect performance in a team sport. But in those types of endurance sports, and maybe you could argue for certain supplements in the area of strength training as well, if you were to measure an individual over, say, several occasions and using, say, your supplement, maybe you do a placebo trial as well, but it's an N of 1. But they see that they actually do have a performance benefit with, supplement X. And even if the research is not supportive of that, then you kind of have to wonder, well, how do you approach this? And my view is that, again, assuming that there's no chance or a very limited chance that the supplement is doing harm, and it's not overly expensive, that it's a waste of money, then I do think there's you got to have that little bit of wiggle room as a practitioner to be able to say, well, this is, these are my own data. This is me in the field doing the best I can, hopefully not fooling myself, and being able to test out on an N of 1 basis whether this practice or this dietary supplement works. And I think that is an approach that I know that many people do take, and it's probably not talked about much because it's hard to write about this, or it's hard to find that type of thing in the scientific literature. But there is a value in that, certainly on an individual basis with athletes and working as a practitioner.
Yeah, that's what I do, to be honest. Because I've had the Prove It salts in the past, and I've got some Delta Force G
Delta
or something,
G,
or rather, Delta G, the actual ester, and I swear that I take a Prove It salt sachet, and then I have some of my best sort of interval based performance runs. And be it whether it's, and I mean it might well be placebo every single time that I do it. But if I am running faster, then I'm obviously getting some sort of fitness benefit from that, and that is in fact improving my performance, I suppose.
Yeah, so like the Improve It in particular are interesting because they have caffeinated versions and uncaffeinated versions, and that allows for a direct comparison. And I think it's definitely one, if not a second study, has also come out where they're comparing the caffeinated version to an uncaffeinated version. And I think one of the most recent study, the conclusion was more or less that the effect was being derived from the caffeine in the caffeinated case.
So it was like a really expensive cup of coffee.
Well, maybe, but that's true of many pre-workouts, I suppose, as well. But at the same time, though, like I do think, and it's what we wrote in our review as well. When you look at the types of studies that have been done to date, many of them are of a higher intensity and of relatively short duration. And that is a little bit problematic because if you look at the kind of physiological rationale as to why or when ketone bodies would be useful as an alternative substrate, I would probably argue that it is in longer duration, moderate intensity type efforts. And so I think this, one of the things that we are very much interested in is whether there might be something in, say, ultra endurance or, prolonged running. And one of the pieces of work, which I can't say too much about because it's not published yet, but there's been an awful lot of work that has compared carbohydrate to carbohydrate plus ketones, and very little that has compared ketones alone. And we've now done that study, and there's quite interesting findings there. There's definitely a difference between what happens when you're consuming carbohydrate and ketones versus ketones alone, versus carbohydrate obviously alone as well. And so hopefully we'll get that research out within the next few months. But it may open up questions in terms of whether ketones alone might be valuable as opposed to trying to combine them with carbohydrate.
Yeah. Oh, interesting, because of course the ketogenic diet really sort of lends itself, or I see it a lot in the ultra endurance type space, and particularly a lot of ultra runners who run like beyond 50 kilometers. It's up to like 100k milers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and like that, I mean, the ketogenic diet has been controversial in the sense that there are a number of studies that show no benefit or adverse effects when it comes to certain performance tests. But again, I would make the point most of them, I won't say they don't make sense, and why would you test it on high intensity performance? But because the answer, that does answer a question: is it valuable for high intensity performance? No. But if you want to look at where it might be valuable, certainly that longer duration, moderate intensity type efforts, where it is possible to use both, in the case of ketogenic diet, higher circulating fat concentrations, free fatty acid concentrations, and also obviously circulating ketone bodies, their intensities of exercise where they would be more likely to be utilized, in preference to glucose or carbohydrates. So as soon as that intensity ramps up, it's very hard to see a scenario where the body would still rely on fat or ketone bodies. It will almost always switch to reliance on carbohydrate. And we did a study, albeit it was a short-term study, it was only 7 days of a ketogenic diet, but even though there was a shift in terms of the intensity at which the body transitioned from predominantly fat to predominantly carbohydrate, that shifted to the right, as we said. It occurred at a higher intensity of exercise. It still did occur. There still did come a point where reliance on carbohydrate for energy provision was the major source of fuel there. So you can't really get over that intensity question, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. Well, your study that you mentioned, that sounds super interesting. So it'll be really good to see
keep an eye out for that.
published. Brendon, can we go back to your comment about the utilization of ketones and the potential shift in EPO levels? Like, can you just describe a little bit about what that study found?
Yeah, so that was a paper that came out of the University of Bath, Javier Gonzalez and James Betts, and nice little study. It's looking at the provision of ketone bodies in the post-exercise period, and it was a rapid communication. I'd probably guess that there's more to come out of that data set, but I think this finding on the EPO concentration was quite interesting. So they showed this transient increase in EPO in the post-exercise period, and it's interesting because obviously, as you know, when there's people are doing altitude training, that's one of the strategies that they're hoping to achieve, is to cause an increase in red blood cell production through this effect via EPO. And everyone knows about the benefits of EPO as a drug, of course, as well. So my read on it is that the data look robust in the sense of the response to exercise, the fold change that's present there, and it seems consistent. So I think it's a real finding. And I suppose the question becomes, how much of an effect could this have in terms of mimicking, say, altitude training or having an effect on red blood cell homeostasis? And when I look at the concentrations that they get up to in the post-exercise period with the consumption of the exogenous ketones, they look to me to be around about what will be seen during altitude training, the early part of altitude training in particular. And I think the point there is that, so it could be practically relevant, the change that's occurring. And I suppose the obvious difference, of course, is that it's transient in the case of the post-exercise period, whereas with altitude training, it's going to be the sustained elevation in EPO for a period of time. So what would we say? Well, there could be a benefit over several months, let's say, of using ketones in the post-exercise period. Maybe that would be enough. But at the same time, I do wonder about, if you're really talking about it, moving the needle on red blood cell homeostasis, does it have to be this, sustained elevation in EPO over, basically the course of the day for several days and weeks, as opposed to maybe this transient thing that's going to occur in the post-exercise period with consuming ketones during recovery. But I do think that the ketones during recovery is an area that is under-researched at the moment. There's one study that looked at the effects on overreaching. There's a couple of studies that have looked at glycogen replenishment, and one other study that's looked at recovery from damaging exercise. And again, the results are very mixed, but at the same time, that's a handful of studies. And the example I always give to people, when they say they dismiss, say, ketone bodies as a supplement out of hand, I'm like, well, there was a lot of studies done on different types of carbohydrates during exercise, and there was a lot of studies done on different combinations of protein and carbohydrate after exercise. And so you can't really dismiss things after a handful of studies, especially when there's, as I said, a fairly decent physiological rationale for why they might be benefiting certain types of exercise performance, why there might be a benefit under certain conditions in recovery. So I think the door is still very much open. I don't think the area, even though we wrote our review and there's a lot of, let's say, null findings within that review, I don't think that closes the door on things. I think there's lots of different areas where we can still look at these supplements and what they might do.
Yeah, interesting. And would you have expected, like, this may be a dumb question actually, but if someone is on a ketogenic diet and they're producing ketones, will that change the EPO, the amount of EPO that is seen, or do we not know that? Or
No, so that's a good question. I think this comes back to I realize we probably didn't address it earlier in speaking specifically about the difference between the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketone supplements. And so one of the most stark differences between the two is that unless someone is in doing a really strict ketogenic diet, their levels of concentrations of BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the main measurement we use, that will probably not really get up above 1. Now, again, people in so-called deep ketosis, people who are really adhering to a ketogenic diet and doing a lot of exercise, they may see values reaching up, 2-3 millimolar at different times. But in the context of what happens with the acute exogenous ketone supplement ingestion, especially the ketone ester, I should say, it's less so with the ketone salts. Ketone salts will get people up to around 1 millimolar. But with the ingestion of the ketone esters, again, dose dependent, obviously, you're seeing values in the 2, 3, 4, 5 millimolar range. And so that was what was observed in that study we're talking about in relation to EPO. So I don't think it's the equivalent that you'd likely to see on the ketogenic diet. Yeah. And again, maybe there's something as well to do with the post-exercise period that's different to, say, just, daily intake of a ketogenic diet. So I think to be continued, I suppose, would be the question there.
Yeah, nice. Nice. That's a nice roundup of sort of where everything is at on that ketogenic research at this point in time, with obviously more to come with those studies that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Brendon, can we chat about your work in muscle health and muscle function?
Of course.
So you mentioned that you've been looking at this for like a number of years now, and obviously strength training, muscle health and function, all really important concepts as we age. And actually, this is just a sort of off the cuff question, but like, how many people do you know that say to you, oh, I really need to get into strength training, and do nothing about it?
Well, it's amazing because. So I was blown away back in the day when I started working on this topic, because I did a talk, and it was like you say off the cuff. It was very short notice. I got asked to do a talk was TEDx, these locally arranged TED talks, and it was at UCD where I was working at the time. And they said they wanted a really short title, and they wanted, I can't remember what the other brief was, but something about actionable information, or so, changing the message, or something about health. So I came up with this title, Muscle Matters, very short title, and I did this talk, and it was basically about the importance of muscle throughout the life course. And I mean, at the time, this is nothing now, but at the time it got like 500,000 views within the first year, which was this is back in 2013, 14 or thereabouts. And the amount of people who were sharing it, talking to me about it, saying, I never knew this about muscle, I never knew this about strength training, I never knew we lost muscle as we age. And I show a couple of pictures in there about the cross-sectional area of the quadricep and hamstrings, and showing the differences with age and so on. And like, people are just blown away by this stuff. And being an exercise scientist and working in the area for a number of years, I was kind of like, how do people not know this information? And it was a real lesson. It's kind of hubris as a young researcher, thinking that everyone knows about what's going on in what you're working on. But I just realized that very quickly that people in the general public know next to nothing about strength training of a certain age. I think the generation of, say, I'm 40 now, my age and younger, I think people are very familiar with the idea of going to a gym, lifting. It's everywhere on things like Instagram and so on. So people are well aware of it. But when I think of my parents' generation and the over 65s that we work with at the moment, they'll understand the idea of strength training, but they have absolutely no concept of how to do it, or why it might be beneficial, or anything like that. So the honest answer, to go back to your question, how many people do I know, let's say of the over 50s, let's just use as a number, it's a very, very small number of people who actually do strength training in a way that would be appropriate for their age and to bring about, long-term benefits. And that does mirror actually with some of the survey data that's done, where they look at, what are the number of people reaching the so-called 2 sessions of strength promoting exercise per week, which again does not define anything about duration, does not define the type of exercise or whatever, but that's often used in these surveys in terms of, are they meeting the guidelines for strength training? And more often than not, the values are 10% or less, and it varies again from country to country and age range and so on, but that's a 1 in 10 on average person who's doing. That's across the life course. That's not just in the older adults who is doing enough strength training to meet those guidelines. So it's a fascinating statistic when you think about then, as we're probably going to talk about, the importance of muscle as we age. Whether we're talking about muscle size, we're talking about muscle function. It's a staggering statistic that only 1 in 10 people are doing 2 sessions a week of strength training. It's really amazing.
No. And it's amazing the number of people who think gardening is strength training. Or
Yeah, and this is a question I get a lot, which again, and it varies. I've spoken in public forums, and I've spoken in to say medical doctors, conferences around nursing, these types of things. We work presently a lot with doing workshops with physiotherapists who are graduates who are moving into the area of maybe working with older adults. And the question that comes back repeatedly are things like, is gardening strength training? Is yoga strength training? Is Pilates strength training? And, on one hand, okay, things like gardening and household chores, they're certainly physical activity and they're better than doing nothing, no doubt about it. They're important. Those types of activities are an important component of overall health. But things like Pilates and strength training, Pilates and yoga, they have actually a really important function from a balance point of view, and they may contribute to some form of strengthening because there's a lot of isometric contractions. But in terms of things like improving muscle size, if that was a goal, or improving some of the other functional components, like climbing stairs, getting up and down out of a chair, and so on, they're probably not the type of training that we would recommend. They're just not specific enough, and they don't involve the dynamic types of contractions that are important when we talk about traditional strength training.
Yeah. So, Brendan, can we talk then about why it is important as we age?
Yeah, well, it's
Can you give me like a 2-minute brief on that?
There are a few different ways of thinking about it. So, going back a number of years, when I forgot to say at the start that when I was initially doing my research as a postdoc, I was interested in type 2 diabetes. And in that domain, we talk about muscle being a reservoir for glucose disposal. And the idea is that, I wouldn't say the more muscle, the better in that case. But when you're talking about trying to control blood sugar levels, you're saying that, well, if you exercise, especially whole body exercise, and you make the muscle more insulin sensitive, then that's there's a bigger reservoir and a place to send that glucose that's being consumed within the diet, carbohydrate in the diet. Again, you probably know that it's now the guidelines have shifted in terms of consuming lower carbohydrates as the first line of treatment in type 2 diabetes. But certainly exercise is going to help from a cardiovascular point of view as well. In type 2 diabetes as well. So there was that kind of idea that it was a glucose sink, so to speak. And then there was obviously the role that muscle plays in locomotion. So if your muscles are dysfunctional, then it's going to affect the way that you move. And that's probably where we're now moving towards in terms of talking about its importance across the life course, is that as we see declines in there are inevitable declines in muscle size and muscle function as we age. And I guess an awful lot of what we're talking about with strength training in older adults is trying to mitigate that decline. So, there's a life course perspective that's often shown. You've probably seen the graph where, your muscle strength or function or size, it rises throughout our teens and into our 20s and probably peaks somewhere in late 30s to early 40s, after which there's a steady decline. And there may be a steeper decline for certain individuals. And that may be related to lifestyle factors or sudden illnesses and so on. But the ideal scenario is that if we have strength training, and like I said, 2 times a week is the current guidelines, that mitigates the rate of decline, and we stay functional. Let's call it functionally independent physically independent for longer, and obviously that's associated with a better quality of life. So that's kind of the broad perspective. And then when we looked at what does the research tell us, usually what we're talking about there is epidemiological research, where things like hand grip strength, walking speed, actual muscle mass are measured in large populations, and then these populations are tracked over a number of years. And the model that's typically done is that you divide up the population based on strength in, say, tertiles or quintiles. Similarly, whether it's walking speed or muscle size. And it's amazing how consistent the results tend to be. The strongest 1/3 of the population or 1/5 of the population, or the people who walk the quickest habitually, or those who have the highest degree of muscle mass, those all tend to have the lowest mortality risk. And the obviously as you move down, and almost always in a in a fairly clear dose response, the weaker you get or the less muscle you have or the poorer your balance, the mortality rates or the incidence of different diseases are much higher in those cohorts. So that I think is again indicating that there is a value in both function and size when it comes to a kind of our long-term health and our obviously then quality of life later in life as well.
Yeah, sure. And I'm thinking, like, I know that you sort of work predominantly, or we're talking predominantly about the older age group, but of course, I always go back to thinking about children today, and how different their lives are compared to, say, when we were growing up or when our parents were growing up. Will that have implications for their ability to build or use muscle later in life? Brendan, do we know anything about that?
I mean, that's a brilliant question. And if someone said to me, you can plow all your research money into something, it probably wouldn't be with the older adults I'd be working. It would be in the younger generations and trying to, for want of a better word, bulletproof their lifestyle in terms of both their habits around physical activity and strength training and endurance training, the whole package they really. And as the whole other can of worms to open is just around dietary intakes as well in kids and teenagers. But to answer your question specifically, so that life course model that I mentioned, where it talks about muscle size and function increasing in younger age, and then it reaches a peak. I think the literature isn't there. So to ask you your question, I don't think the literature is there, but intuitively it makes sense that what someone engages with as a child or as a teen or certainly into their 20s is going to affect where that peak or what that peak is, in terms of their functional ability or their, say, for example, muscle size. And once you've reached that peak, then, as I said, the question is, what is the rate of decline after that? And some people refer to the idea of increasing your ceiling. And in other words, the higher that peak is, the better able to be able to sustain a certain level of muscle size or function above a threshold, which is sometimes called the disability threshold. Is this idea that there is a point at which your function becomes so impaired that you become, independent or physically independent, and that's, as I said, known as a disability threshold. So to wrap this all up, I'd say that, the things that are done, the habits, again, you have to remember these are habits that are often being formed as well that influence, where that peak will occur. And these habits then are taken into later life. So establishing really good habits in kids and teens around exercise, around diet, making sure that peak is, as high, let's say, as it can be, that's going to definitely have, in my opinion, positive impacts throughout later life. So there is a huge body of work that I think needs to be done in terms of trying to get that message. It's all well and good talking to older adults and people in their middle age about improving their health and their practices now, but you can improve things for that age group by getting things in line later or earlier in life, and I think that is where some work really needs to be done.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Um, Now, I've heard you say, Brendan, that you're not a fan of the term sarcopenia because it doesn't necessarily, it's almost a diagnosis which might sort
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
shift someone's thinking in and around their function, I suppose, or their health. Can you first define sarcopenia and then just
Yeah.
talk to me about that?
Yeah, so be careful about how I phrase it. I don't like the term. So the word is fine. It makes sense. It
Yeah,
comes from
yeah.
Greek. It means poverty of flesh, and but that's an important point because it originally was defining the this age-related loss of muscle mass, and the focus was. At that time, I would say this is the late 80s that it was first defined, was on this idea that we lose muscle mass. And that's not because the researchers at that time were not interested in muscle function. It just became the defining characteristic in those early definitions was around muscle size. But everyone knows that there's a relationship between muscle size and muscle function. So, the two kind of go hand in glove. And so more recently, there have been, and again, there are different definitions from different organizations, but initially, a lot of the discussion was around, like I said, muscle mass and function. Now, the most recent definition from the European Working Group is more that it's a disorder of muscle function. And size is a kind of secondary measurement that's used to define sarcopenia. So when you say that I don't like the term, I actually it's the way the term is used actually is what I find troubling because there's two elements to it. One is just being pedantic. People say sarcopenia when they really mean just a muscle wasting in general, and they're obviously not the same thing. So that's just me being pedantic. But the reason I don't like it as a concept sometimes is that it's not like, obviously there are defined criteria to diagnose someone as sarcopenic, but there's a whole period of time in the lead up to when they eventually cross those thresholds. And by the way, I'll define those thresholds in a second. But there's a whole period of decline up to the point that someone becomes defined as sarcopenic, which is an opportunity for people to intervene. And I just sometimes worry that the medical system will, approach this problem in a way that, well, we're not going to do anything until the person is objectively defined as sarcopenic, and at that point we're going to intervene. And the point is, again, like I was saying earlier about maybe things what happens with kids translating to later life. If you can intervene earlier in someone's life before they're sarcopenic, the chances of improving quality of life are certainly, I think, improved. So that's kind of why the concepts, I think, could be maybe treated just a little bit differently in terms of how they're used. So just on the thresholds and what's used. So the model that's used at the moment, again based on the European Working Group's recommendations, is to first of all, there has to be kind of a clinical suspicion that there is sarcopenia, and that will trigger then an assessment pathway. And initially, it's things like grip strength, walking speed, chair rise test that are used. So and they're obviously measures of muscle function. And then again, there are specific thresholds that I don't know off the top of my head, but there are specific thresholds where if you're below that indicates probable sarcopenia. At which point the requirement, if you're going to define someone as overtly sarcopenic, is to measure their muscle mass by some objective means. So these are usually DEXA, CT scan, MRI, and if the person is again below certain thresholds on any of those different devices, they're defined as sarcopenic. And then there's another battery of tests that can be performed. Again, physical tests now in this case, timed up and go test, 6-minute walking test. There's a couple of others that are in there. And again, if they're below threshold they're considered severe sarcopenia. So you have kind of like clinical suspicion, you've got probable sarcopenia, you've got sarcopenia and severe sarcopenia. And the point that I would make, and we have this discussion all the time with physiotherapists who are working in practice, is that they will say, well, we don't necessarily have access to the types of devices that can measure muscle mass, so we can't define sarcopenia, and therefore it won't trigger a care pathway. Again, this is maybe specific to Ireland compared to other countries. And that kind of goes back to my point about the use of the term and the way people think about it. If someone is demonstrating, if there's a clinical suspicion, someone's over the age of 65, they're showing impaired muscle performance, in my mind, thinking about it as a practitioner, I don't necessarily need to know whether they've got low muscle mass or whether they're, defined as sarcopenic to know that if their performance is lower than expected, we should be intervening with an appropriate exercise training-based intervention. And I suppose that, again, is no more than I was talking about practice in performance nutrition. That is kind of trying to thread this needle of, applied practice versus what the research and what the clinical definitions say. It's always a tension that you have to try and get your head around.
Yeah, totally. And a couple of things you said just made me think. One about when you were talking about this being a clinical definition, and it's almost like until you reach that point, nothing's going to happen or you're fine. I feel similarly actually about blood glucose or how we measure A1C, that once you reach this point, well, you're pre-diabetes, but if you're like 1 point off that, oh no, you're sweet, continue on. So, like no point, no worries about, anything to do with your diet or lifestyle.
It's a tricky one because, relatedly, it's things like, whenever you see thresholds that are based on like the number 5 or the number 0, you're kind of like, this feels a bit arbitrary, whereas, it's just, there are always, as we've said a couple of times, both of us, it's not just that all of a sudden overnight you wake up and you're now sarcopenic or type 2 diabetic. These are, declines in metabolic or muscle health that are occurring over several years. And again, usually in most cases, what we're talking about here are people, a defining characteristic is probably low levels of physical activity, or maybe in the case of muscle health, a lack of strength training. And it's, at any point along that continuum from, let's call it the peak to, wherever this person is measured on their, in terms of decline, there can be an opportunity to intervene and the changes can be made, and the sooner the better, and, there's a lot of messages that we can, one-liners we can say, the sooner the better, more is better, something is better than nothing. Like, there's so many of these messages, but it's making them land and giving people the tools to be able to actually execute those types of training programs is really where the challenge is.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned 65 in there when you were discussing sort of one of the characteristics. Is that sort of an age whereby we see it most often, or is there early sarcopenia? Like how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of that is I think it's a legacy of the fact that older adults in many studies are defined as 65 and above. And so and again, middle age obviously is usually something like 40 to 65. So we kind of have these categories that we put buckets we put people in when we're talking about research studies. And that idea of 65 and above has kind of been then used in some of the definitions that are around sarcopenia. Now, on the other hand, obviously, as I said, people's health could be declining for many years before that. So there's that element to it as well. But the other point I make is that a 65-year-old is different to a 75-year-old who is different to an 85-year-old. And in the Western world, life expectancy for most people is somewhere in the 80s. Most of the Western countries. So you often hear in nutrition we talk about context and so on, and that is true as well. I think in the context of older adults, what we might say to a 65-year-old might be quite different to how we treat an 85-year-old. The likelihood of being sarcopenic at 65 is a lot less than being sarcopenic at 85. There's people who are masters athletes at the age of 65. There are people who can no longer even get out of their bed at the age of 65. So, there are huge differences in terms of what we're talking about when we say older adults, when we're talking about the age of them, when we're talking about their physical activity levels, their capability, and so on. So, again, when you're looking at, say, interventions, say, around exercise or diet in the research, it is really important to be looking at what was the profile of these older adults. So in a lot of the studies that we've done, we've used pre-sarcopenic or not sarcopenic at all in some of our studies, and they are very different interventions that might happen, let's say, in a frail individual who's in a nursing home, because again, most of our studies were involving people who were community dwelling. So there's just an enormous continuum in terms of the different types of people that can be classed as older adults in any of these research studies. So the devil is in the detail in terms of interventions and what works.
Yeah. Brendon, with regard to, I guess, just the overall health of the general population, like you hear statistics like in the United States, for example, 93% of people are metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah.
Does that have implications for our muscle health as we age and function?
So the way those studies have been done is usually, again, epidemiological research, where they look at two or more comorbidities hand in hand and see what the influence of one is on the other. And if we use the example of type 2 diabetes, for example, it is well known that the presence of type 2 diabetes increases the likelihood of sarcopenia in later life. And again, it's sometimes hard to untangle the question. You could look at it the other way and say, if someone is sarcopenic, they're more likely to be type 2 diabetic. But again, just thinking about the progression of disease, I think you're more likely to develop diabetes first before developing sarcopenia. And so I would guess that the more metabolically unhealthy someone is, it's a lot of it, of course, is to do with diet, but physical inactivity is a huge part of that as well. And then if there's physical inactivity, I think that's the main driver of poor muscle function in later life. So I think it's hard to disentangle multiple different comorbidities, but most of the evidence would point in the direction that if you're metabolically unhealthy, you're unlikely to be in good muscle health. So that's.
Yeah, no, that's good. My father very recently, just this Christmas, he had COVID, and then he had cellulitis, and then so he was sort of bedridden for like 2 weeks. And when I saw him, he's 77 70 now, and he's very fit. He cleans, and so he's always like, and he still works and full time, and he works on his garden. Well, it's not a garden; it's a jungle. But so yeah, he's quite physical. But when I saw him, he's quite a lean individual. He had next to no, like his whole upper body. He was very thin. And I also heard you say on a podcast, Brendon, listen, I heard you say this, that like across the course of like 10 days, someone can lose like a decade's worth of muscle. Is that, did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, it's coming from that kind of one-liner as well is coming from a number of different studies that have looked at bed rest studies. And the bed rest studies are interesting because on one level, prolonged bed rest is often used as a model for space flight, for example. The short-term bed rest studies, usually 10 to 14 days, they are good approximations of what happens when someone goes into hospital with a thing like influenza or a fall leading to a fracture, or COVID, for example. So scenarios where someone is bedbound for a short period of time. And in the research studies that are done, there's some very nice summary data that came out just before Christmas in terms of the time course of change in different muscles within the body and in terms of function. And what you see is that in those first 10 to 14 days is where the most amount of decline occurs during bed rest. And that idea of like a decade, within 10 days, that is kind of it's looking at the idea that when we look at declines in muscle mass over time, from that peak to the decline and the inevitability in older adults, typically what's given as an average is about a 1% per year decline that occurs over the age of 65. And so when you have on average in these bed rest studies 1% per day, it becomes 10% over 10 days, and that effectively becomes that decade worth of loss. So it is a useful, like it's factually correct, first of all, I suppose, but it's actually a very powerful message to give to people. Now, the likes of your father, for example, and many, many others, oftentimes it's very difficult to do anything about it as an individual. So a lot of what, like I said, what we're doing with physiotherapists at the moment is just trying to get that message across that, there are lots of different ways to do some form of muscle contraction when someone is bedbound. Again, assuming that, their condition allows for it. But like that, the upper body wastes away very quickly. The lower body does as well. I shouldn't split it by body parts. But there are certain exercises that can be done. And again, there's other research around things like neuromuscular electrical stimulation, while someone is lying in the bed, and the effect that can have in mitigating loss. So, again, anything, anything is better than nothing when it comes to some of those interventions. But those ideas, the idea that why does someone decline more rapidly than someone else, over the course of 20 or 30 years, there's this idea, which is the catabolic crisis model, which has been put forward, which is that there's multiple insults of this nature of short duration bed rest or illness where someone's muscle mass declines more rapidly than it should over a short period of time. They ultimately never recover that function or size that they lost over that short period of illness. And as a result, over time, you imagine that the stepwise reduction in muscle mass or function becomes greater than it otherwise would be if someone didn't have these so-called catabolic episodes. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about, first of all, how we should mitigate anytime there's a chance that you're going to have a period where there could be muscle wasting, try and mitigate it as best as possible. And during the period after the bout of illness or bed rest, try and engage in a program that rehabilitates someone back to the level that they were at. I think that's the type of way we should be thinking about these, addressing the so-called catabolic crisis model.
At the age 70 that my dad's at, I gave him a Dynaband and showed him how to use it with his upper body. Is it recoverable? Do we know?
Well, that's a great question. Again, if we were to say, what changes can be made with exercise training interventions in older adults, you would say that the gains that are made in various different studies of 12 to 24 lengths that are done, 24 weeks that are done with strength training, the magnitude of those changes are equivalent to the magnitude of loss that might occur over 10 to 14 days. So in theory, I would say, yes, we can recover. But funny enough, there's actually an absence of studies where there is an enforced period of loss and then there is that recovery period. And they, again, would be really nice studies to see is that And again, there are like, what would I say? There are a couple of review articles that propose, there can be exercise and nutrition interventions while the person is bedbound. There can be exercise, nutrition, and interventions in the post, let's say, bed rest period. And, in theory, they will work, mitigate the loss, accelerate the recovery. But we actually need more studies to be able to really drill down into what is the dose of exercise, what is the right prescription from a nutrition point of view to both mitigate the loss and accelerate the recovery. So I would say in theory it can be done, but as you well know, exercise training interventions tend to be supervised 3 days a week. It's very intensive. Leaving someone to their own devices to try and do those types of programs, we know that initially they don't want to, they're not training anyway, and now we're asking them to begin to undertake a training program that's really intensive. So again, the difference between theory and practice there is kind of highlighted again.
Yeah, for sure. And finally, Brendon, you mentioned the catabolic crisis. Catabolic crisis happening over, several times in a person's. Well, actually, this is my question: is that sort of from the 40s, from when we know we start to lose muscle, or is it across a short time span after 60?
Yeah, well, like again, as an athlete, you would know that if there's a period of injury, for example, metabolic fitness or aerobic fitness will decline very quickly. It's the whole use it or lose it principle. So we know that can occur even in young individuals. People who have an injury, a fracture that gets cast on an arm or a leg will see very rapid declines in muscle size and function as well. So it can happen at any time. But what we do know is that, say, the rate of loss in a bed rest study is about 3 times or 4 times as high in older adults compared to younger adults. So it certainly is worse, let's say, the older we are. And how often it occurs, well, that is really down to the individual. There are people who are getting, unfortunately, sick or having an issue, an episode every year. There are others who might have one once a decade. And again, that is obviously going to influence the trajectory of decline as we age. And like I say, if the intervention can be done in that post-illness period to try and bring them back up to where they were, that's obviously going to be the best prescription. But as we well know, that's not often the case.
Totally. Do you know Rob Wolf, Paleo Solutions?
Yeah, I know of him, yeah.
Yeah. He once said that we need to basically build as much muscle as possible, then fight like the devil to keep it on, basically, for the rest of our lives, from now till forever.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it because, like I said, that's kind of the idea of, trying to maximize that peak in early to the middle life. And then, I haven't heard him say that before, so that's a nice one.
Yeah, it is. It's good. He says it much more eloquently.
Yeah, no, I don't know him personally. I've been at a couple of conferences because he's been in that sort of keto space as well. So, he's an enthusiastic guy.
He really is. Brendon, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate just your wealth of information. I could talk to you for a whole lot more, but you've got a day to do, and I've got to go to bed.
You got to go to bed, yeah.
Yeah. Now, apparently, you're not on socials. Is that right? Are you on Twitter?
That's right. Yeah, I think I'm one of the few.
Crazy.
Not yet. You can find my research.
Yes.
You can email me. That's traditional like that, but no, it's a funny thing. I just never got into it. When things were really kicking off, and then I was kind of a bit contrary. I sort of resisted going out when people told me I had to, and now I just look at the amount of time that I'd have to commit if I was to take it kind of seriously, and I just don't have that time. So I'm happy where I'm at. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and we can put links to your ResearchGate in the show notes. That would be amazing. Brendon, thanks so much.
My pleasure, Mikki. Thank you.
All right, team, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed doing that interview. And next week on the podcast, I'm super stoked to bring to you a conversation with Hashimoto's expert, Dr. Emily Kybird, all about Hashimoto's, how to diagnose, how to treat, and what lifestyle management techniques really work. So I think you're going to get a lot from that one, obviously. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, where you can sign up to one of my meal plans or book a nutrition consultation or call with me there. All right, team, have a great week. Talk to you soon.